And at this time, I would like to introduce our Secretary, Kelly Thomason, Secretary of the Commonwealth, who is going to introduce the Honorable Ralph Northam. Thank you so much for coming, Governor.
Thank you so much, Chief Ann and Rappahannock Tribe for hosting this event today. It's such an important opportunity, and I know we all know that, every person in this room. But I think back a couple of years ago to when the Pamunkey first got federal recognition, and that was new for Virginia, right? Our very first federally recognized tribe. It was long overdue. We'd been fighting for it for a long time. And when it happened, then everybody sort of said, well, what happens now? And I think we're still figuring that out, but I actually went up to BIA and I scheduled a meeting and went to DC and I said, so we're new at this, right? We've never had a federally recognized tribe before. What are the best practices? What should we be doing? And they looked at me and said, those are really good questions. We've never nobody remembers having a state with brand new federally recognized tribes that never had them before and never had a roadmap. So I think you're doing the right thing. You're on the right track. You're asking good questions. Good luck. And so it wasn't super helpful, but we've been continuing to work with the tribes and try to figure out this roadmap. And I'm really excited that this conference could happen today because it's such an important piece for all of us to continue to have these conversations and work together to figure out what's next. We have heard a lot today about leaders in the past who made really terrible, awful decisions, and that's putting it mildly. I am very glad that I work for a governor who makes much better decisions and who believes in doing the right thing and wants to lift up everybody here. And Governor Northam, when he was running for governor, frequently would say sort of his tagline, and it wasn't just a tagline, but he means it and he lives it, is we want to build a Virginia that works better for everybody, no matter who you are and where you're from. And that's really what he has exemplified during this administration from so many efforts across the board. And we've got state agencies here that touch all areas of life that are working to make Virginia better for everybody and certainly for our tribes. And so it's really been an honor and pleasure to work with all of you and certainly with Governor Northam. I'm proud of the work that we've accomplished. We've only got a couple more months to keep doing it, but we're not done yet. We've got a lot of work left to do and a lot of things that we still want to make happen. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Governor Northam.
Well, thank you, Kelly, and good afternoon. And I hope everybody's having a great conference. I don't want to tempt you at all this afternoon, but it is a beautiful fall day outside. So anyway, I'm sorry you have to be indoors today, but I hope you've had a great conference, and I know you've had some great speakers. And I want to take the opportunity. We have had a lot of people in our administration who have been interacting with folks that are in our tribes across Virginia. And Kelly Thomason, who was just here and introduced me kindly, has done just so much amazing work along with folks in her secretariat. So please give Kelly a round of applause for all of your wonderful work. I want to say thank you to our host, the Rappahannock Tribe, and Chief Ann Richardson. Thank you so much for your leadership. And really thanks to all of you for being here today, particularly the chiefs of our 7 federally recognized tribes. I also want to thank so many of our state agency leaders for being here today. And I see Delegate Krizik from Northern Virginia. Welcome, and back to Richmond. I know it's been too long for you, but you'll be back here again soon in January. Hard to believe. But just want to start off by saying that education is critical to our success, and this is an important opportunity to come together to learn what sovereignty means and how we as state government leaders can best work with tribal government leaders. Virginia has a long and complicated history, but we must always remember that when European people arrived here, this land was not empty. Instead, it was home to thousands of people, the ancestors of the tribes represented right here today. It was long overdue for the United States government to officially recognize Virginia's tribes, but I'm glad that recognition finally came for 7 of our tribes, the Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Monacan, Nansemond, Pamunkey, Rappahannock, and Upper Mattaponi. Now we come together to build new government-to-government relationships. And I think we all would acknowledge this is new territory, as Secretary Thomason said, for all of us. We have not done this before. But that's all right. We are all here in good faith and with goodwill, committed to getting it right and to continuing to build positive government-to-government relationships. I look forward to working with the tribes to create diplomatic and collaborative relationships that, as Kelly said, work for everyone. And while this formal relationship is relatively new, we have a long and fruitful history of working together. During our administration, we have taken important steps to further the interest of Virginia's tribes. Last year, I was happy to open Virginia's 40th state park, Machucomico, which not only preserves an historic landscape, but provides a way for us to better tell the full story of the Powhatan Confederacy and all of Virginia's tribes. In 2019, we worked with the Mattaponi tribe to transfer title of land to the Commonwealth to hold in trust for the tribe, living up to a 342-year treaty and helping preserve the sustainability of the tribe and its unique history and culture. And also in 2019, the Virginia Land Conservation Grant Foundation worked to protect land called Chickahominy on the Powhatan, preserving an important culture and historic site for the Chickahominy tribe. And our administration continues to look for additional resources and opportunities to provide further land acquisition for tribes in Virginia. It is an understatement to say the United States and state governments have too often failed to live up to the terms of agreements made with the tribes who were here first. But I hope that here in Virginia today and moving forward, we will continue the friendship that Virginia's tribes and the Commonwealth enjoy and strengthen their friendship that with our new government-to-government relationships built on trust and goodwill. So again, this is new territory, but it's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad all of you have taken time out of your schedule to be here to work together collaboratively so that we can all move forward together. And as I always like to tell people, you know, Virginia is about inclusivity. We are about diversity, and we want to make sure that Virginia is welcome and treats everybody equitably. So thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. Have a great weekend and hope to see a lot of you soon. Thank you so much.
I'm going to speak a little bit while you're standing here. I'm going to talk about you a little bit. Is that okay?
They're going to have to come up here?
As Governor Northam said, Kelly Thomason has been our secretary. She was our secretary before federal recognition. She has been so responsive to working with the tribes, helping us to strategize and using state resources to help us lobby on the Hill. It's been a distinct pleasure to work with her because I know that she truly cares about this deeply in her heart and desires justice for these tribes. And I'd like to thank Governor Northam for his leadership in the social justice movement that has been launched in Virginia and so long overdue. And he has brought that forth in such strong leadership. I met the equity and inclusion, diversity. Is it Dr. Underwood? Are you still here? There you are. And I also served on his Equity and Inclusion Commission prior to this, and he was setting all of this up during that time. And so he had a desire to see more equity and inclusion and justice in Virginia, and he's been pretty radical about it ever since. So I want to thank you, Governor. Thank you so much for your support. Aren't they beautiful? Thank you all so much. And now, without further ado, the man of the hour, Dr. David Wilkins, is going to come and wrap this up, the speakers, and then after him, we're going to have a question and answer session. So all of you who wrote your questions down earlier, get them out. Dr. Wilkins and the other people that are on the panel, the chiefs, will be here available to answer your questions. Dr. Wilkins?
Thank you, dear. Good afternoon, folks. Good afternoon, folks. Good afternoon. That's better, thank you. I'm really proud to be here. I'm a Lumbee from down North Carolina way, belong to the Lumbee Nation. And I was really tickled when Chief Ann Richardson invited me to come. And I really want to show some appreciation to Pat Morris for all the really hard work she's been putting in for the last several months. And I'm thankful to be here with all the various chiefs. I know a couple of them. Chief Branham there. And I hope to meet the rest of you during my stay here in Virginia. My wife and I moved here from Minnesota 2 years ago after 20 long years in Minnesota Viking country, and the cold and the Vikings finally drove us out and drove us back to the south. So I'm happy to be closer to home, if not quite at home. And I also want to thank my wife, Shelley, who's with me here. She's been my best and brightest in my life. As we near the close of this historic day, I'd like to reflect on what it all means for our shared path. We've heard about the history and current context of the political relations between indigenous peoples who have always existed within their boundaries now shared with Virginia, as well as the various non-native governments those peoples have encountered over the last 4 centuries. For too many modern Virginians, this is a haunted, ancient history. But as William Faulkner once aptly wrote, the past is never dead. It's not even past. The treaties made in good faith all those years ago remain today's reality, as we heard from the wonderful presentations this morning. We have convened because federal recognition of the natives represented here today has shifted the balance of power and breathed new life into their sovereignty and willingness to engage in intergovernmental relations with the Commonwealth of Virginia. In November, the leaders of these nations will meet with President Biden at the White House Tribal Nations Summit that honors the nation-to-nation relationship they have with the federal government. Locally, that realignment has been ignored by most, seen as a threat by others, and welcomed by a few who recognize the potential for mutual benefit. I believe that we here in this room are part of those few who feel the relief and joy of those alive during a moment of justice being hotly pursued. Over the last few years, Virginia has made significant progress in transforming relations with communities of color. Just look at Monument Avenue right now, right? No more Confederates there. And Columbus took a dive too, I do believe, right? So the governor is to be commended. I don't know what all he's done. We've only been here for a couple of years, and I haven't heard a whole lot about his record. I will trust the chiefs to inform me as to whether he has fulfilled the words that he said earlier. But we know that things are beginning to move in a better direction. So now is the time to seize the momentum and begin a new era in the state's relations with the Native nations, not just for righting wrongs, but for building partnerships in education, economic development, and environmental protections that benefit everyone. Other states and tribes have done so to great effect, and if the leaders here today will act with vision and integrity, we can succeed here as well. So I want to end this day by saying why the tribal Commonwealth relations matter, why now is the time to formalize intergovernmental relations with just such a covenant between the federally recognized nations of this region and the Commonwealth. This historic action should be manifested at all levels of government through an executive order, legislative statute, judicial processes, and adoption of the sovereignty accord that is here before you. These actions would protect the interests and integrity of all parties in this area. At this moment in time, the question is, do we have the leaders, do we have the political will and the courage to move forward? I'll spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about the current situation, offer some background on the history of Native-state relations, briefly explain the legal underpinnings of sovereign powers, and conclude by outlining a future course for better government-to-government relations. We've heard how political and economic relations between Native nations and state governments have been at times violent, contentious, neglectful, but occasionally cooperative, depending on the shifting balances of power. Since the founding of the United States, Virginia has gradually assumed more and more authority to deal with indigenous peoples within the boundaries of their lands. Now, with federal recognition, tribal nations are working to identify and build the systems required to take back those powers that Virginia has taken over the last 400 years. No entity relinquishes control easily, however, so the reality is that we are looking at a future full of disagreement, negotiation, but also hopefully compromise. It would be wise to accept this early on and build a system to deal with issues fairly and consistently. This situation is not unique to this area. Each state that shares geography with indigenous nations has such a story. Unfortunately, most scholars, attorneys, and politicians focus on the role of the federal government and how it has treated Native peoples. That means the conversation is by and large removed from the day-to-day lives of ordinary citizens who are usually more aware of local actions. States and local governments, even those who are neighbors of Native members, remain either genuinely or willfully unaware of the rights and the powers of our nations. To everyone's detriment, they regularly have violated various federal and tribal laws. What's worse is they've missed many opportunities for mutually productive relationships. Today, there are 34 states with geographic areas contiguous to Native communities or reservations. In some cases, like the Navajo Nation and the Mohawk Nation, their borders are shared with several states, and Mohawk lands actually extend into Canada. And of course, they share some citizens. Native citizens who live within reservations or on trust land are citizens of their own nation, have rights as state citizens, and have federal citizenship as well. Although non-natives can and often do live on native lands, they enjoy state and federal citizenship, but they are not native citizens and have no vote in tribal elections. So reservation-based native folk have citizenship in 3 polities: their nation, the state, and the federal government. We are the only peoples with treble citizenship. We should be the most protected peoples in the country, right? When you think about that. And yet it's our indigenous citizenship that makes all the other citizenships that much weaker. And that makes no sense on any level. And what we've heard today confirms a lot of that. Although Native nations and states share citizens, some resources, and land masses, as separate political entities, they have each historically guarded their collective rights to political powers, economic and natural resources, and cultural histories. They have rarely been friendly neighbors. As the Supreme Court said in United States versus Kagama in 1886, tribal nations owe no allegiance to the states and receive from them no protection. Because of the local ill feeling, the people of the states where they are found are often their deadliest enemies. This statement, sad to say, still largely holds true today in many of the states that we call our country. There are general feelings of resentment and frustration on all sides. There are occasional exceptions, and if we here in Virginia are successful in this endeavor that we've begun today, although it's been building for many years, we may be able to counter this darker narrative by forging a more cooperative relationship based in consent, trust, and mutual respect, themes we've heard throughout today. Across the United States, Native nations resent states' frequent attempts to tax and regulate their lands, their wages, their industries, and are rightly irritated that many states remain reluctant, even in the face of overwhelming historical and legal evidence, to concede the longevity and reality of indigenous sovereignty and recognize our government's competence to handle complex regulatory and administrative duties. Particularly unique to the nations here is the never-ending battle against extinguishment. Natives rightly feel invisible and are thus often fixated on having and on being seen and understood. Understandable given Virginia's shockingly successful effort to bureaucratically eliminate evidence of their continued existence. Those familiar with my work know that I rarely use the word genocide to refer to the treatment of indigenous peoples by the U.S. I prefer the term ethnocide, as the United States never had an explicit policy to eliminate all of our peoples. They could have, right, at a certain point in the late 1800s, but they never did do that. But there were certainly those who committed genocidal acts, but Congress never passed a law ordering the systematic elimination of Native peoples, although we saw from the previous presentation a number of examples that constitute genocidal activity. But Virginia, however, is the exception. Virginia, along with two other states, Texas and California, are the only U.S.-based governments that I would say codified and carried out a deliberate policy of genocide. But Virginia's was even more unique than even Texas and California. Technically bloodless, it had the desired effect of statistically erasing Native peoples and communities wholesale. Natives whose families had lived, worked, and died here since time immemorial were rendered legally invisible. The Commonwealth efficiently created nations of ghosts. There were, of course, more direct violent actions. Forced sterilization was not uncommon. And over the century following the Civil War, many children were taken from their parents outright or sent to re-education camps, euphemistically called boarding schools, such as the Hampton Institute. Now known as Hampton University, you can visit the graves of Native children there who never made it home. 7, 8, 9, 10-year-olds. My wife and I went down there last month, and it broke my heart walking through that cemetery. Virginia led the way in this regard as well, as this school was to be the model for Carlisle and all the other boarding schools that followed in the wake of Hampton and Carlisle, who stole generations of children, many of them lying in unmarked graves, as we know from the recent reporting, right? The losses were staggering, and the impact is still felt today. Nations of ghosts. Although personified by the infamous bureaucrat Walter Plecker, as we saw from the clip earlier, the ultimate responsibility does not lie with Plecker alone. It lies with Virginia's elected leaders, who gave Plecker free rein to bloodlessly eliminate all the Native people by his rules and his policies. Plecker's work was even cited at the Nuremberg trials. He corresponded with Walter Gross, the director of Germany's Bureau of Eugenics, and was a popular speaker at international white supremacist conferences. Imagine that. The policies of this Commonwealth used as templates for the Holocaust. while he is long dead and undoubtedly experiencing justice on the other side, Virginia has never atoned for these 3 decades of crimes against Native humanity. Never really attempted to address or repair any of the damage that Plecker's policies called that Virginia's leaders allowed to happen on their watch. That it was accepted and then largely forgotten is sickening. Banal kind of evil. No wonder natives within these borders are so focused on being seen. They were legal phantoms for so long. States, for their part, resent the fact that while they have jurisdiction over virtually all activities and persons within their borders, this authority does not generally extend into tribal national affairs, nor to natives residing on reservations or trust lands, areas generally not subject to state jurisdiction or taxation. Native nations are right to amplify their presence as while Virginians, the beneficiaries of those decades of genocidal policies, are surprised or even disbelieving that genuine Native peoples have continued to exist here. I fully anticipate a backlash when tribal nations begin to more openly flex their political, legal, and economic muscles. Hostility, denial, and questions of authenticity will soon replace the sorrowful, romanticized certainty of bureaucratic elimination. Most folks don't give up their cherished myths easily, do they? Whether it be racist team mascots or statues honoring white supremacy, and they will cling to questionable ownership and undeserved privileges even harder. So, how did this come to be? Nation-state tensions trace back to colonial period debates about whether the national government or the individual colonies, later states, would manage U.S. Indian policy. And we heard wonderful reports this morning. At the Philadelphia Convention, it was determined that Congress would have exclusive control over trade relations with the sovereign nations, and that the national government would continue the treaty relationship with indigenous nations that other Europeans had been practicing since 1607, the first one in this state, right? Later, as the United States expanded west, various territorial acts, and later the enabling acts admitted most western states into the Union. Those new state constitutions, 10 of them in the western states, were required to include disclaimer clauses recognizing the federal government's exclusive jurisdiction over Native affairs. Not over Native peoples, but over the federal government's relationships with them. States were told to stay out of the business. You don't know how to do Indian affairs very well. All right? So 3 factors: congressional plenary power defined as exclusive power under the Commerce Clause, not absolute, exclusive, because that's the only power the federal government has vis-a-vis our people, right? The Commerce Clause just says Congress can regulate trade with us, right? They don't have any power over us. They've just assumed that over time, right? But plenary exclusive power, treaties, and state constitutional disclaimer clauses, along with our inherent sovereignty, effectively precluded states from any direct involvement in our affairs for many years. The facts before us are very clear. Virginia in its various forms may be a little more than 400 years old, but the Native nations assembled here today have been around for at least, 400 generations, all right? That's some longevity there, folks. Thus, these very original and very mature nations have a political status, as one federal court put it, that is, quote, higher than that of states, all right? Not lower than, not municipalities, but higher than states. This reasoning is grounded in the realities of our long-standing tenure, our inherent sovereignty, our nation's ability to negotiate treaties, the trust doctrine, and the doctrine of congressional exclusive and preemptive power, that is, in relation to state governments. In theory, these facts and constitutional doctrines should shield Native peoples and their lands from state interference and abuse, but in practice, they have proven to be a porous shield at best. In recent years, tribal nations and their neighbor states have entered into compacts, developed comprehensive state and Native policies to guide intergovernmental relations, improved educational curricula to ameliorate stereotypes and to better educate all citizens, and engage in a number of negotiated settlements in an effort to develop more cooperative relations. More importantly, for our purposes, several states and native nations have worked out executive orders, enabling legislation and sovereignty accords like the one before us today, the Tribal Commonwealth Accord, which lays out a structure and defines a commitment to implement and institutionalize a government-to-government relationship that is rooted in mutual respect, improved understanding, and consent that is free, prior, and informed, right? We heard from that earlier, which is laid out in the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. FPIC is called. I remember that because it reminds me of toothpick. I use a lot of toothpicks in my work, all right? But the Accord lays out a structure and defines a commitment to implement and institutionalize a government-to-government relationship. I just said that. Jumping ahead. In the Accord, each state agency is responsible for implementation of the mechanisms necessary for government-to-government relations when dealing with issues of mutual concern at their origin points. And tribal officials agree to communicate with the appropriate state agency in a manner that upholds the spirit of the Accord. These steps are not just advisable and possible here, they are sorely needed. An executive order would establish the intention to travel a straight path that could be codified by state law, and the signed accord is the culmination of this process. It will be beneficial for many reasons. Most obviously, it unites all governments around the shared purposes and ideals, and in practical terms, it will save the state and the nations lots of money, right? Because if you're agreeing to talk to one another, you're not running to the local courthouse, right, to file another lawsuit. So there are many opportunities for profitable and healthy partnerships in sustainable economic development, environmental protections, and renewable energy. Native nations now have the legal and economic means to leverage their powers on behalf of all those who reside in Virginia. What benefits them will not only benefit them, but also the entire community that they are surrounded by. And this is happening in many states that embrace these changes, and all are the better for it. Over time, it would also lead to an educational environment whereby tribal nations were finally acknowledged and welcomed as the original and senior sovereigns with knowledge systems, cultures, and languages, a benefit to everyone in the area. More and more states, including Connecticut, Colorado, Washington, Montana, and North Dakota, have begun to mandate the addition of Native history and culture in their K-12 programs. I don't know where Virginia is on that, but that's an area that needs to be jumped on right away. It would send an important message to these troubled and divisive times that Virginia, the state with the oldest treaties and reservations, was finally beginning to act with a level of leadership, maturity, and decency that one should expect from a polity so rich in history and tradition. It is in keeping with the work that has been started in other communities. Executive diplomacy and action through an order and the Tribal Sovereignty Accord should be but the first stages. Both the legislative branch and the judicial branches must do their part to acknowledge the distinctive sovereignty of the 7 sovereign nations here. Following the example of other state legislatures, it would be appropriate for the House of Delegates and the Senate to establish permanent standing committees on indigenous affairs so that a level of expertise will finally begin to develop on issues concerning the nations and the intergovernmental relationship with the Commonwealth. And the judicial branch should reach out to each of the nations by offering assistance as the tribes begin to gear up to establish their own court systems. Governments need court systems, right? Still, serious fault lines will likely remain between tribal governments and the state, counties, and other municipalities over issues like the meaning and scope of indigenous sovereignty, environmental protections, gaming, hunting and fishing rights, taxation matters, water rights, child welfare, land claims, historic preservation, religious freedom, and you could just go on and on. Litigation, therefore, will likely remain for a spell as the most common approach to settle these differences, though there is little evidence that lawsuits do much to promote a deeper understanding of one another's problems, needs, or aspirations. And it seems to me that Native folks here yearn for that deeper understanding and recognition of common humanity. The intergovernmental relationship between Native nations and states is an evolving and dynamic one. It's complicated by the overarching presence of the federal government, which on the one hand has treaty and trust obligations to our nations, but on the other hand is constitutionally married with the states, right? So which side is the federal government going to take when there is a conflict between a tribal nation and the state, right? We know historically which side they tend to weigh in on, right? Despite the treaties and despite the trust doctrine. Relations will improve from a Native perspective only if state officials will display the foresight and courage to accord the Native nations in their midst with the respect and recognition they have long been denied. This means action based on the legal, political, and moral reality that the 7 recognized nations are sovereign entities entitled to exercise self-determination in all phases of their daily lives: political, economic, cultural, and legal. Jurisdictional uncertainties, state indifference, and Native frustrations will most likely persist unless state officials step up and admit that they have much to learn, beginning with the fact that they must now engage sovereign to sovereign with the First Nations in their midst. This will not be easy because all governments, be they indigenous, state, or federal, are operated by human beings who are sometimes enamored of beautiful sounding concepts like sovereignty, or sovereign immunity, or self-governance, without really taking the time to understand just how difficult it is to fairly, responsibly, and justly administer the individual and governmental interests of one's own diverse populations, much less how to interact with those same interests in other governments. The truth is, in the end, whatever happened in the past, long overdue federal recognition for these 7 sovereign nations has forever changed the landscape and the balance of power in this region. Whether or not non-Native folks choose to accept and learn from centuries of mistakes is largely irrelevant. It would certainly make interactions in this new era easier and more productive, but regardless of willful ignorance or outright resistance, these nations now wield new levels of power and influence that can no longer be ignored by the state. The eras of exploitation, genocidal, bureaucratic erasure, and paternal condescension are over. Native peoples refuse to be treated as ghosts in their own lands anymore. As we close this important event, we open a new chapter in the book of the region's history, wherein we unite to improve the well-being of all those who live within the borders of these 7 nations, in what is now also called Virginia, through the development of a solemn, formal government agreement that will last in perpetuity if the leadership and the peoples so desire it. We have to accept that our lives and our fates are irrevocably, if tragically, intertwined, and make a conscious choice to move forward together with full knowledge and respect, not just with words, but with consistent, good faith actions rooted in formally binding covenants. As signatories of the Tribal Commonwealth Accord, these governments recognize the unbroken strength and continuity of indigenous sovereignty and define the mutually beneficial opportunities that exist in the formalization of true and respectful government-to-government relations. In this next chapter, all parties should rise with a shared fate and purpose to meet the moral obligations held by each human being. It is by no means the conclusion to our shared saga, but our combined efforts will make it possible for future generations to add their own chapters. There is so much to be gained by gathering as fully visible human beings and sovereign nations, no longer ghosts, at the same table to begin a new day. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Well, we are nearly at the end of our day, And so much information has been given to us. But you know, as we end the day here, as David so appropriately said, it's a new day. It's a new day for the Commonwealth of Virginia and for the 7 federally recognized tribes. And no longer will we suffer in silence, as our nations had done for generations. Now we have an opportunity to come together in reconciliation as true humans with compassion for one another, for desire for justice for one another, for a vision of the future that is includes human decency, respect, honor, consideration for one another. Leading the state in a new day with policies, an accord, if you will, that can take our tribes into the future. You know, all of the chiefs, I think, are middle-aged, I'd like to say. And the tribal chiefs are middle-aged, and we have to depend on the next generation to carry forth the work that we have done in our lifetime. And so it is very important for this accord to be established and for our next generation to be trained on how to have diplomacy with the state and federal government. And so if we come together in a spirit of reconciliation, of leaders in a state who have a vision for justice for all, as the Constitution says, we will be together building a better Commonwealth, a better America for all people, not just Native people. But the Native people will be respected for the sovereignty that they had on the land before anyone ever came. That we will no longer be erased, and that we will no longer be ghosts in the land, in our own land. But we will be seen, we will be at the table, making decisions alongside state officials and federal officials that will rebuild the communities and the nations that have been dismantled by colonization, and the things that have come after that, the structures of the government that have come after that, but really based upon those same laws and precepts. So I would like to thank all of you for coming, and at this time, where's Shelley? Shelley, do you have any questions yet? Okay, so if you want to come up here, and Shelley is going to be our moderator for our questions. And David is going to be, excellent. David is going to be the moderator for our questions. So thank you, Dr. Wilkins. Come on up. And before I wrap up, I would like to thank all of those staff people from the Rappahannock tribe that worked so hard for so many months to put this together for all of you.
Thank you, Chief Ann. These are a few questions from this morning's panel for our presenters. This first one is sort of a general question, and either of you can answer. How can we help get the facts out about us, that is Native peoples, included in the Virginia educational curriculum, that we are here and aren't going anywhere? Any ideas on that, panelists?
So I guess I'm on because I live here and I have children who are in the public school system in Virginia. I think this is a great question, and it's actually one that I'm constantly entertaining. One of the new pieces that I introduced into some of my classes the past year as we've been remote is an Ask Me Anything section. And I constantly get these questions about, why didn't I learn about this in high school? Why didn't I learn about this before? Why have I not heard these stories? And some of those questions are pertaining to Virginia Indians in particular. And so I think one of the kind of unique features of primary and secondary education is that you have a lot of young teachers. And I think one of the things that is happening is we're starting to see some of these teachers who are coming in with a very different historical background, very different educations. They are learning from people who are still active in these fields, right? And so you do have a lot of young teachers who I think are more often more attuned to some of these diverse stories. I know some of my students are teaching in my children's schools, which is a little surreal, but that does also mean that I know that they've been through my course on Native American history. They've been in my intro classes where we're talking about Virginia Indians as part of this broader story of American history, of dispossession, of colonialism, and these colonial relations that don't end. So I think that's one piece of that. That, of course, is less formal than some of the standard curriculum and some of the state requirements. And that, I think, is something that is more challenging to affect those changes, because I think that's part of a political process. There are people who have been in those education fields for a long time who maybe don't have that recent training, that recent exposure to scholarship and all of those stories. And so I think there is more momentum working against introducing those stories and entertaining them and taking them very seriously and foregrounding them in Virginia's history, in U.S. history, from some of those folks as well. So I think there's something of a tension. I do think there is some progress there. I know I've been invited to speak at my kids' schools and been able to feature clips from an oral history that we did with Chief Ann a few years ago, which was the first time I had met her. And so able to sort of bring those into some of those classrooms. And so I think teachers, educators really are open to that possibility, but it is a slow process because of those state standards and curriculum, I think.
Excellent. All right, this one is for you, Ed. It was said that Indian children under 12 years old were sent to live with and serve English families. Did Indian families voluntarily offer their children, or were they forced to go? And were the Indian children educated by the English? And how long did this practice continue?
Okay. So the case that I was specifically referring to in 1705, when the Nanzatico were sold into slavery and their children are bound out to the Virginia Council members, we really don't know what happened to those children. The records are sort of silent there. As far as treaties go, it had always been the ambition of the English to educate children, and they say in their early documents as a way of breaking the superstitious influence of native priests. So a way of changing their religion. And you get them when they're young, you can indoctrinate them into Christianity, and they no longer feel that affinity to their tribal families. There are instances in the 17th century of Native communities sending children to live with the English as a way of learning to speak English, as a way of learning English ways. But pretty quickly in that process, tribal members would say, we're choosing not to send our children to live with the English anymore because when they come back to the Native community, they don't know anything. They can't do the job. They can't perform the functions that are necessary in a tribal society, in a tribal community. They don't know how to hunt. They don't know how to fish. They don't know how to plant corn. But they're skilled in English customs. There are several instances in the 17th century where tribal leaders, the Werowinces, refuse to send their children to live with the English because they say, I only have this one son remaining. The others have been killed, and I'm not sending my only son to live with you. So, it varied from tribe to tribe to tribe, but there was a pretty general consensus that if they sent their children to live in English homes, when they returned back to the tribal community, they didn't know how to live in a tribal community because they had been away from it for so long.
Excellent. And this one deserves a response from both of you, I think, because you both used maps. And it's a two-parter, but it's interrelated. To what extent are maps tools or weapons in understanding historic and present-day Indian-white relations? And relatedly, to what extent do historic maps possibly reflect indigenous understandings of the landscape?
Right?
The what? Oh, yeah.
That was the first thing I thought of, sorry.
And I didn't really think of that, but that's good. So in fact, I had a conversation yesterday with a couple of folks at the Library of Virginia who are interested in creating a collection that's more accessible to people doing research on native subjects. And one of the things that they were interested in was, a reinterpretation of John Smith's map. And they were curious, how tribal communities would view that map, and really, they were really interested in how would a tribal person in the 17th century view John Smith's map? Would it make sense to them? And I responded with, well, what you should do is juxtapose the indigenous map of the world with that of John Smith's map of Virginia. And for those of you who have read John Smith's works, you know that in the winter of 1607, when he is taken captive by Opechancanough and trotted around to the various tribal villages on the Middle Peninsula, one of the last stops is at the Rappahannock town of Tappahannock to determine if he had been the one who had killed their former werowance. And John Smith was too short for that. As the tribe remembers, the offending Englishman had been very tall, and John Smith was short. But in the process, and through this adoption ceremony that John Smith goes through before the mythic saving by Pocahontas, he describes very vividly that he's put into this room, and native priests come in and they recreate the map of the Algonquin world. And that map it's in the center of that map is a fire, and then it's surrounded by a ring of crushed corn, and then that is surrounded by sticks, and then surrounded by kernels of corn, and it represented the people. The fire represents the center. The crushed corn represents the people. The sticks represented the water, and it just kind of goes out in a circular fashion. And for me, that said a lot about how they viewed the world around them, not as something that ever ended, but as something that was just this continuous circle. I don't exactly remember where the question was, but I think, that's what I would say.
So I guess to add a little bit to that, I want to refer back to Dr. Taylor's presentation where she had the map of the river system with the half moons for towns and their sort of locations there. And I'm also thinking of, I'm sorry we don't have it to display, but a Chickahominy map that I can think of, I think, is that has a series of circles, and then there's lines connecting them that represent sort of the configuration of different peoples within the Southeast, and I think it's from the early 1730s. I'm not entirely sure right now. But you've got these very different representational languages. If we're thinking about cartography and these early modern maps, that's still kind of in formulation, but there is this European sort of perspective that this is essentially an objective mapping of space. And it doesn't capture any of those relationships. You don't get a sense of sort of what's at the center of those native worlds, of the relationships between the different people who are located, and who are located in a very static fashion, right? We get different accounts that show Tappahannock on different sides of the river, depending on who's there, when they happen to visit, and what they're trying to capture or convey about their story and their history there. And you get, of course, the idea that this is kind of objective space that they're mapping, but that objective space itself is kind of this language of empire, right? It is overriding all of the relationships and the configurations and the reality of how hard it might be to get from one location to another. Maybe it's 100 miles between two spots on this map that the English sort of draw out, but in between there's a mountain range and there's enemy territory. It's not really 100 miles apart, right? And so that is, again, overlooking the realities of an indigenous landscape and all of these different peoples that inhabit there.
And I'm going to pick up on something that you said, Jason, and it's something that Dr. Taylor mentioned in her presentation this morning, that the different conceptions of how waterways functioned in societies. The English saw waterways as dividers. So if you look at county lines and, you see very clear demarcations that use water lines as references oftentimes. If you think about an indigenous perspective of the land, waters were central points. They were the highways between towns. So that when you talk about Tappahannock, there is a capital town on the south side of the river. There's a capital town on the north side of the river. They are not distinct communities. They are a single town. And the Rappahannock River, even though it's probably a mile wide there, is the connector between those two communities. And you find this in every major tribal community in Virginia, where water is the connector between spaces, not the divider. And again, a different conception of how land is used.
All right. Thank you very much, folks.
So we have an intertribal organization called VTEC, and I know that all the chiefs are aware of it. And we have their vice chair here to talk about it. So no further ado, here, what's your name?
It's Cook Swartz now.
Oh, Cook Swartz. Okay, this is Miss Cook Swartz from the Pamunkey Reservation.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Thank you for this
You're
time. Good afternoon, everyone. I know this is something that was not on the agenda today, but I see a lot of questions and people's minds are raising questions about education and about the children and elders and things like that. So what the Virginia tribes, all 7 federally recognized tribes did was form what is called VTEC, which that means Virginia Tribal Education Consortium. So this is first in history. In any other state, we all came together and we decided that education for our children is very important. And what can we do about this? So we all formed this. It's a 501c3, and we have representatives from each and every federally recognized tribe in Virginia, which we are the first. So this is a history moment, historical moment. And I'm very proud to be a part of this. I'm vice chair. I'm Pamunkey. My name is Alan Cook Swartz. And I just want to let you know we are working with different counties. We are working with VTEC. We are working with other organizations. It's continuing education. It's talking about capacity building, bringing our Native children to high income capacity for jobs, opportunities. It's also going to be working with educators. We are working with Virginia Department of Education as well. We're working with the state. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities, and you're going to see us even more. So look out for the logo, and it's called VTEC. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. That's quite an accomplishment, and education or the lack thereof has been an issue as long as I can remember, and I was 65 last week. And so, it's something I know that my dad and my granddad both fought for in this state. And now that we have this, it's going to be working with local counties to put information in the school books that our children can learn about their own people, and their friends will know who they are and that they're Native American, and they will no longer hopefully begin to make fun of us because we were so harassed in schools for being different and because nobody knew who we were. So now that information is going to go out into the counties and around the state, and I'm very proud of the work that you guys are doing, Alan. Thank you so much. And so this brings us to the close, and I just would like to thank all of you for coming, all the segments of the state, agencies, and our assemblymen that are here. Thank you for coming, the governor that came. Thank you to VPM for being here and being such a support to what we're doing. And thank you to all of the staff people that have made this possible. Thank you, beautiful ladies from the Women Warriors. Thank you so much for being here. And thanks to the Machucomico drum and my assistant chief for the prayer. I appreciate everything, and I expect that this is all going to come back in maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and just be looking for it. Pat is also going to send each of the registrants a survey, so they can fill out the survey, and if they have questions, people who are virtually with us today, if you have questions, you can put them in with your survey and return them to us, and we will get your questions answered. So I thank you for your time today. It's been a beautiful day, and God bless you.